So we are going to continue our journey through the book of Ruth. And so we have kind of come to a turning point in the story here in chapter 3. And so the famine that drove Elimelech and Naomi out of Bethlehem has ended. Naomi has returned to make her home in Bethlehem again, and Ruth with her is making her home there for the first time. Ruth has also been blessed to find consistent work in the fields of a faithful man named Boaz, who's providing for her needs abundantly, as we saw last week. And then we get to chapter 3, and chapter 3 is one of those chapters that's really ambiguous. It's hard to find out exactly what is going on. The narrator just doesn't tell us all of the details that he does in other parts of the book. And it's also a chapter that's filled with risk-taking activity. You know, as now that Naomi and Ruth's needs are their basic needs for life and provision are met, Naomi is turning her attention to helping Ruth find a husband and make the most of the rest of her life. And so even though Naomi is satisfied, she has food, she has provision, she has a home, she still has this idea that her life is over. But not for Ruth. She has turned her attention to helping Ruth make the most of whatever is left of her life. And so as we look at chapter 3 this morning, I want us to see two main lessons and then 4 applications that we can learn from Ruth and from Boaz here in this story. But I just invite you to listen. You can read along. And so it's going to be a little different as I'm going to try to tell the story as opposed to just reading it to you. And so this is the story of Ruth chapter 3. And so one day Naomi came to her daughter-in-law Ruth, and she said, "Isn't it time that I find you a good home and a good husband to take care of you? And after all, aren't you working in Boaz's field? You know, he's one of our family redeemers. And tonight he's going to be winnowing the barley. He's gleaning the barley. And so I want you to go to him. I want you to take a bath, put on some good smelling perfume, and don't put on the clothes that show that you're a widow, but put on some of your best clothes. And I want you to go down to where he's at. But don't let him know that you're there. Wait until after he's eaten and drank and he's ready for bed. And once he's fallen asleep, quietly go over to him, uncover his feet, and lay down beside him to let him know that you are available to marry. And after that, don't worry, because he will tell you exactly what to do next." And so Ruth said, "Naomi, I will do whatever you say." And so she begins to get ready, and she's going to where Boaz is, and she's putting their plan into action. And as Boaz he's finishing up winnowing the barley, he's eaten, he's drank, he's feeling good, and he's tired. He goes to lay down, and he doesn't know that Ruth is there also, and he falls asleep. And so after he falls asleep, Ruth quietly sneaks over to him. She quietly and carefully uncovers his feet, and she lays down beside him. And in the middle of the night, he rolls over, and he's startled because, to his surprise, there's this woman laying next to him. And he's half asleep, and he's stumbling around. He's like, "Who are you?" And Ruth says, "I am your servant, Ruth. I've been working in your fields. Please, you are one of my family redeemers, and I'm begging you to protect me and to provide for me and to take me under your wing and to marry me." And so Boaz says to her, "Oh, daughter, how kind you truly are. Of everything that you have already done for your family, what you're doing now, far surpasses that kindness. Because everybody in town knows how noble you are. They know of your great character. You could have had your pick of anyone, whether rich or young. What you are doing now is more kind than what you've already done for your family." And you're right, I am one of your family redeemers, but there's one who is closer than me. But don't worry about anything. Just lay here tonight. Tomorrow, if he wants to marry you, he will have his chance. But if he doesn't, as surely as God wills, as surely as God lives, I will. And so Ruth laid back down. She went to sleep, but very early in the morning, while it was still dark, she woke up. She began to leave to go back to where Naomi was. But before she left, Boaz gave her 6 quarts of barley so that she wouldn't go home empty-handed. She goes back to Naomi to tell her everything that has happened. And of course, when she gets there, Naomi's waiting expectantly. She's like, Ruth, how did it go? What happened? And so Ruth tells Naomi all that happened, how Boaz was kind to her once again, how he even gave her 6 more quarts of barley to provide for their needs. And at this point, Naomi is feeling very confident that the time will be short before Ruth finds someone to marry her and to redeem her. And so this is the story from Ruth chapter 3. And again, there's a lot of questions. We don't really know exactly what all happened that night. Did Ruth and Boaz engage in forbidden sex? Did they maintain their integrity? The narrator is very ambiguous with his language, but there's all throughout this chapter, there's just these sexual overtones of what really went on. And so, but through it all, we get clues, I believe, to the true character of Boaz and to Ruth. And we also see, even though God really isn't mentioned a whole lot, he's not actively involved, we see his hand working behind the scenes to continue to care for their good and for their redemption. And so the first lesson I want us to see is from the perspective of Boaz. And so I want us to see how Boaz responds to this strange and unique situation. And if you can, just try to put yourself in his position for a minute. He falls asleep alone. He's done he did his work for the day. He falls asleep completely alone. And in the middle of the night, he's startled. He wakes up, and next to him, there's this young, beautiful woman who's signaling to him that she is available to marry. Ruth makes her intentions perfectly known. And so how does Boaz respond? And so, if we look back to chapter 2, during the daylight hours, when everybody was looking, if you look back to chapter 2, in verse 10, sorry, that's not the right verse. Verse 4, when Boaz he's coming to the field for the first time, when Ruth has been working there, there's this strange woman in his field, and this is what he says in verse 4. He says, later Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, and he said to his harvesters, the Lord be with you. And they said to him, the Lord bless you. And so when everybody is watching in the daylight hours, there's this strange woman in his field. He's talking about God. He's talking about how he wants the Lord to bless his workers. But how will he respond when nobody is working and it's not a strange woman in his field, it's a strange woman in his bed? And so how is he going to respond when nobody is watching? And I want us to, before we kind of see his character, think back to the very first phrase of the book of Ruth. The narrator tells us that it was during the time of the judges. And we talked about that in the first message of how there was no king in Israel. Everyone was doing whatever they thought best. They did whatever they thought was right in their eyes. And so now Boaz finds himself in a situation alone with a woman. It's dark. He can do whatever he wants, and no one would ever find out. He can take total advantage of the situation. He can take total advantage of Ruth, and he wouldn't get caught. Even if she accused him of adultery. He could turn around and accuse her of being a prostitute. And remember, he is a well-respected man in the community. And Ruth is a foreigner. She's a poor widow from Moab. Who do you think the community is going to believe? All the power and all the favor is on Boaz's side. He can do whatever he wants and walk away completely without any repercussions. And you think, well, maybe, but Boaz, he's a good person. He's an Israelite. He should know better than to take advantage of a situation like this. And you're right, he should, but we also have to remember that this was the time of the judges. You know, if you are bored in your quarantine and you are just, you want to see how deprived we can be, even God's people can become. Judges 19 is one of the most depressing stories in all of the Bible. It's not preached very much, and it just shows us how far we can fall, even how far God's people can fall away from him. You know, in short, there's an Israelite man who's traveling back to his home with his concubine, and on their way back, they decide to stop in a city. They're not going to make it all the way home, so they stop in a different city to spend the night. And they're waiting there in the town square, and a man comes and he says, why don't you come and stay with me? I'll give you food. I'll give you a place to sleep. And so they do. He goes back to their house. They eat. After dinner, wicked men from the city, they come, they start banging on the door, demanding that the owner of the house send out the traveling man so that they can have sex with him. And the owner's like, no, this is wicked. You can't do this. And so, but the men, the wicked men outside, they don't give up until finally the traveling man takes his concubine and throws her out the door, and the men of the city rape her until she's dead. And if you're thinking, that can't be a Bible story, go back and read Judges chapter 19. And so that is the day and age that Ruth and Boaz are living in. People have no regard for what is right, for what is decent. You know, it sounds like Sodom and Gomorrah, but you have to remember that is happening within the country of Israel. And so imagine the courage that it took for Ruth to put herself in this very vulnerable situation. She knows of Boaz's good deeds. She knows of his character, but that's all in the daylight. How is he going to respond when nobody is watching? And then think about the temptation that must have filled Boaz's head, that he could do whatever he wants and walk away scot-free. But let's look back at how he does respond in Ruth chapter 3. And so we saw how he talked about God in the daylight, but what would he do in the dark? Look at Ruth chapter 3, verse 10. So this is after Ruth has said, I am your servant, she replied, take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer. And then he said, may the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness now than before, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Now don't be afraid. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people in my town know that you are a woman of noble character. So Boaz responds the exact same way. In the daytime, he says to his workers, to his servants, the Lord bless you. When everybody is watching, he's talking about how he wants God's blessing to fall on his people. And here, when nobody is watching, when it's dark, he says, may the Lord bless you to Ruth. He talks of God in the daylight when everybody is watching, and he talks of God when no one is watching. And so that's the first lesson that I want us to see this morning, is that what you do in the dark is just as important as what you do in the light. And so I just ask you the question, what are you doing? How do you respond to situations when no one is watching you? Do you act one way when everybody is around? Do you act a different way when you are all alone, when there's no one watching, no one to catch you? How are you responding to situations that come your way? What you do in the dark is just as important as what you do in the light. And then the second lesson, the next lesson I want us to see comes from the perspective of Ruth. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that, and then we'll kind of talk about it. But it's that faithfulness leads to redemption. And so Ruth has continued to be faithful in every area of her life. And God has taken notice. Again, even though God isn't really mentioned, Boaz talks of him, but he's not actively doing anything. He's not actively speaking. But we get the idea that God has taken notice of the faithfulness that Ruth is showing. Her redemption is near. You know, if not from Boaz, somebody soon is going to marry her. Somebody is going to redeem her. Everyone knows of her noble character. And so God has not let her faithfulness fall by the wayside, as we saw in chapter 2. He's going to use someone to provide for her. And so the same thing is true for you, that if you are faithful, God is going to take notice. He's not going to let your situation continue to go on and on and on without a redeemer. But on the surface, if we look at it, it seems like this might be some type of works-based salvation. Because Ruth is doing what is good, because she's doing what she's supposed to, that is why God is blessing her. That is why God is taking care of her. But that's not really what's going on here at all. Ruth doesn't have a whole lot to offer. Remember, she is a poor widow from a foreign country, living for her, a foreign country in Bethlehem, and she doesn't have anyone to take care of her. She doesn't have anyone to really provide for her. She's without a husband. She doesn't have any children. And so in the grand scheme of their economy in that day and age, she has nothing to offer. She's not giving millions of dollars. She's not doing all kinds of good deeds, hoping that God will notice that and bless her. But all she has to offer is her faithfulness. And she's continuing to be faithful to all those around her. You know, she's struggling to survive, and she's being faithful to her mother-in-law, Naomi, in doing what she can to help them survive. And remember what Boaz said back in chapter 2, verse 12, when who it was that really Ruth had come to seek shelter from. Boaz said, "May the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." So Boaz is saying, really, you're seeking help from the Lord. But look at what Ruth says in chapter 3. When Boaz asks who she is in verse 9, she says, "I am Ruth, your servant," she replied. "Take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer." And so Ruth here is using the same language, the same vocabulary that Boaz used when talking about blessing her. Boaz is referring to God blessing her, but Ruth is asking Boaz to be the blesser. And so in other words, she's asking Boaz, will you be the instrument of God's blessing for me and for my family? She knows that she doesn't have anything to offer, but she's striving to be faithful to God and to do what God expects and what her society expects. And so for us today, you know, God is faithful. There is nothing that he can't overcome. There is no situation that he can't redeem. No matter how hopeless you may feel, no matter how difficult these days are, no matter how trying some of your physical situations are, there is nothing that God cannot overcome. There is no hopeless situation when we continue to be faithful and when we continue to look to God. And so now I want us to kind of see, how can we apply some lessons, some life lessons from this kind of strange chapter here in Ruth chapter 3. And so to do that, I first want to ask you to ask yourself, you know, what is what is an overcomable situation for you? What is something that you cannot overcome on your own? You know, we know for Ruth and for Naomi, it was imminent starvation. They suffered through a famine. They weren't sure where they were going to get their next meal. everyone who could possibly take care of them has passed away and died, and so they are facing imminent starvation. But what is it for you? What is the situation that no matter how many resources you throw at it, doesn't seem to get resolved? You know, as I read through the weed chat on a daily basis, honestly, as a pastor, sometimes it's overwhelming. You know, part of me is very thankful and grateful of just the heart that we see from the people of Salem Baptist Church, that you are a people who pray, that you are a people who are continuing to let your requests be made known to God. But on the other hand, it seems like as soon as we get a praise, there's 3 more or 4 more, or sometimes pages more of all these requests that come through of people who are facing devastation physically or emotionally. And sometimes it's just overwhelming. And so what is a situation, whether it's for you, someone you know, that you just can't seem to overcome? No matter how much you pray, no matter how much resources you throw at it, it just doesn't seem to go away. You know, some of you can relate to the story of Ruth and Naomi, of having your entire life turned upside down by devastation. When something just happens out of nowhere, that it just completely turns your life upside down and you don't know where to turn. You know, how are you handling it? Where do you go when things like this hit you and when you have nothing left to offer? You know, I think we see from our society that some people, they respond like Naomi when they face these situations, that they just tend to give up. They think, well, there's no real hope. Yes, maybe there is a God, but right now he's on vacation. He's not working for me. And so they just begin slowly to lose all hope. And then there's other people that, unlike what Boaz did, they may try to take advantage of the situation for their own good. They're like, well, this situation is out of our control. I'm just going to make the best of it as I know how. And they compromise their integrity. And so people respond to challenges in different ways. But when you are feeling hopeless, when you are feeling that you have nothing to offer, that you are facing this challenge that you can't overcome, where do you turn? And how do you respond? And so for Ruth, she decided that she would, and to some degree Naomi, they decided that they were going to tackle this problem with creativity, with hard work, and they were going to keep their faith in God. And that is what I want to encourage us as Salem Baptist Church to do. And from a church perspective, collectively, we all face somewhat of an overcomable, or a situation that we can't overcome, in the fact that we want to be a blessing to our community. But when we go outside the walls of Salem Baptist Church, there's not a whole lot of community to reach. And so we're faced with the situation of how can we be a blessing to the community when there's not many people around us. But if God can provide for Ruth and for Naomi out of seemingly nowhere, he can provide opportunities for ministry for me and for you and for our church. And I want us to see 4 ways that we can continue to be faithful regardless of what we're facing. And one way is like Ruth, she was faithful to those near her. And so I challenge us as a church to be faithful to those who are near you. You know, she was faithful to Naomi. She was faithful to her family. And so even in times of uncertainty, even in times of where we don't know how all of our situations are going to turn out, we can still continue to be faithful to those around us, our family, our friends, our neighbors. And so just as Ruth was continually working hard to take care of those near her, I just encourage you as individuals and as believers to be faithful to those that God has put around you. How can you be a blessing to those who are near you? And then also we see that you can be faithful by working hard. You know, of all the people who had reason to give up, Ruth probably had more of it. You know, in Israel, they were supposed to care for widows, but instead of just looking for someone to provide for her, to give her a handout, she's asking if she can go to work. And so she is faithful to work hard. She was working, as we saw in chapter 2, from sun up to sundown. She is working hard. And so don't give up on your situation. no matter how hard it is, continue to work hard at it, to be faithful, to trust that whatever God has given you to do it with joy, to work hard at it, because he's not going, just as he didn't forget what Ruth had done, he's going to notice what you do, and faithfulness leads to redemption. And then the next is to be faithful in your character. You know, how do people refer to you? Boaz is telling Ruth that in the middle of the night that everyone in town knows how great of a woman she is, how noble she is, how much of a hard worker she is. But what about you? How do people in the community, those that are close to you, how do they refer to you? Live in a way where you can maintain your character and your integrity. Again, not just when everyone is watching, but when no one is watching. Live a life of integrity. And then lastly, I want to encourage you to be faithful to put others before your own desires. And really, ultimately, this is what Ruth is doing all throughout the story in the book of Ruth, is that she is thinking less of herself and she's thinking more of those around her. She's putting Naomi before herself. She's putting Boaz before herself. She's not worried about her needs. She's worried about the needs of those around her. And really, that's what Boaz is praising her for. She says, the kindness that you are showing now is greater than what you've already done. And this word kindness it's used all throughout the Old Testament, but it means you can better describe it or better define it as faithful love. Ruth is showing faithful love to Naomi, and now she's showing faithful love, this kindness, this faithful love, not just to Naomi, but to her entire family, those who are still alive and the ones who have passed away. Boaz is saying the kindness that you are doing, the faithfulness that you are showing to even your dead husband, is you are putting their needs and their name and their integrity in front of yours. Because again, she could have started her own life. She could have gone back to Moab. She could have done a number of things. But she is continuing to try to preserve the name of her husband and of her father-in-law. And Boaz sees that as a greater kindness, as a greater faithfulness than even what she's already done by putting Naomi before herself. And so I just ask you, how are you putting others before yourself? Even in a day and age when everybody is seeking out, what do I need? How can I get what I need? And there's less thought of taking care of others. How are you putting others before yourself, before your own good? And I just want to close with one practical way that Salem Baptist Church has been so faithful to do in the past. And I want to encourage us and continue to do this even in a difficult time this year, and that is through giving to missions. And so there's no better way to really practice the principle of gleaning, to sharing the blessings that God has given you with others, than how we can give to missions. And this time of year, every year, we give to the Annie Armstrong Easter offering that goes to our missionaries in North America and Canada as they are planting churches, they're sharing the gospel, they're doing leadership training. And so every dollar of the Annie Armstrong Easter offering goes directly towards those efforts. And so last year, Salem Baptist Church gave $2,700. And so I want to encourage us this year to set our goal at $3,000. And in a time when our country and our world is facing uncertainty, it makes sense to kind of hunker down and not to give. But what better time to show where our faith truly is? It's one thing to say that we have faith in God, but it's another thing to put ourselves in the situation where Ruth did, where she's going to go into that dark room and she's going to put herself out there and she's going to trust that this man and her God are going to provide for her needs and not take advantage of her situation. And so we have the opportunity to do that, to continue to bless others, to continue to give, to continue to talk about God when no one is watching, when the world is saving, when hunkering down, when trying to hoard up for what we need. We have the ability and the opportunity to give and to bless. And so I encourage us as a church this year that you just pray individually about what the Lord would lay on your heart. How can you be a blessing to others who may not be in physical need, but we know just as much as there are physical needs rampant through our world today, the most pressing need that anyone ever has is the need of salvation in Jesus. And so we have an opportunity to give financially to these causes, that even though we may not now even really be able to get out and move around in our own community freely, we can continue to give so that the Word of God does not fail, so that it continues to go forth, so that new churches can be started, so that dying churches can be revitalized, so that the gospel can be preached to those who haven't heard. And so I just encourage you to pray, to think, how can God use me to glean what I have so that others can hear the saving message of Jesus? And so all throughout the month of April, we're going to be receiving offerings. Again, if you, our P.O. Box number is 1743, so you can send that to Salem Baptist Church at P.O. Box 1743 in Big Spring, Texas. The zip code is
79721.
I'm sorry, 79721. You all know the zip code. I'm the new guy here. But P.O. Box 1743, Big Spring. And so just label that as Annie Armstrong, and we will get that in the right spot. And so again, we're going to take the entire month of April, and we may stretch it into May also, but we will just encourage you to continue to pray, to continue to see, even in times where our physical capabilities may be limited, how can God continue to use you to be faithful, and trusting that faithfulness is going to lead to redemption. And so let me pray for us this morning.